Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue Is Atheism Dead? The book by Eric Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author who has had books translated into 25 languages. He's the host of a nationally syndicated radio show and acclaimed conversation series, Socrates in the City. Metaxas is a prominent cultural commentator who has had writing appear in the New York Times, New Yorker, Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. He's written an article on the scientific evidence for God that was published in the Wall Street Journal. Today we continue part 3 of Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas. Part 3 is entitled What is Truth? Chapter 23 is entitled The Boundaries of Science More Than Meets the Eye. This picture, you have what is observable, what is above the ground, and then what's below the ground is not observable. Science is not the only path to knowledge or truth. Yet the new atheists have made this idea the bedrock foundation of all else, so that they are not merely atheists, but are really also strict materialists. The new atheist wants you to believe that science is the only path to knowledge or truth. But if you think carefully about it, you will see that that's really not true. Since they know science is limited to what it can tell us about the material world, they have made the irrational leap to say that the material world is all that exists. It is irrational to say that materialism is true. To say that materialism is true, that the material world is all that exists, is false and reductive, as though someone were to insist that human beings are only the sum of the chemicals that make up our bodies. Most of us know that we are far more, because we know that goodness and truth and beauty and love are real things, even if they can't be isolated in an experiment with glassware or measured with calipers. You don't have to do an experiment to know that goodness, truth, beauty, and love really exist. So to assert that only the material world is real, and that only reality is material and that the only reality is material reality, is a kind of willful madness. Or as Paul would tell the Romans, it's suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. To assert that only the material world is real, and that the only reality is material reality, is willful madness. But it seems that because materialist atheists cannot prove that the soul exists via scientific means, they skip past vast fields of logic and claim it has been proved that the soul does not exist. But they can't prove that the soul does not exist. And when you look at some of the research that has been done by people like Lee Strobel and many others, multiple others, let's say, about near-death experiences, we see that the soul exists. They have not proved that the soul does not exist. They cannot prove that the soul does not exist. Of course, limiting reality to the material world is arbitrary and illogical. In fact, limiting reality to materialism is perfectly unscientific. It is also silly, as though a baker were to announce that anything that cannot be baked is not food. That is an irrational statement. It's utterly subjective, and like all perfect subjectivity, it is meaningless. Even in the world of science, we often reason our way toward a conclusion without physical evidence. This involves using our imaginations and is called hypothesizing or theorizing. If scientists did not hypothesize or theorize, we would never have discovered anything. So on this, we must be clear. Even if we're only talking about matter and science, we're nonetheless at some point forced to go beyond the strangely strict parameters laid down by materialists. Can't limit knowledge to the scientific parameters laid down by materialists. The history of science itself is a history of people using imagination and intuition, of theorizing based on what facts and evidence we have thus far. In doing this, we're often obliged to use models we cannot see with our eyes or discover with our four other senses, but which we believe must be there based on previous information. So let's look at a brief history of matter. Even when we talk about matter itself, we eventually may find ourselves drifting beyond the strictly material in the world of our five senses. For example, scientists have theorized about atoms and molecules for millennia before anyone could see them. The ancient Greeks theorized that matter, at its foundation, was composed of invisibly tiny particles, which they called atoms, which simply means not divisible. It wasn't until the late 17th century that the Anglo-Irish chemist Robert Boyle and the French chemist Nicolas Lemery came to the idea of what we call molecules. They thought of what we call atoms as corpuscles and thought that when these united in geometric patterns, they made up what we call today molecules. But obviously, they were theorizing and could not begin to see what they actually were talking about. Around 1800, the British chemist John Dalton began theorizing about how atoms link up with other atoms to form molecules. Dalton is credited with inventing what we now call atomic theory, and he worked with indirect evidence. Just as we see the leaves moving on a tree and infer that the wind has moved them, but never see the actual wind, which is invisible, scientists observe things happening, and they speculate on how and why these things are happening, hoping to see patterns and make inferences. Sometimes they theorize correctly, and sometimes they don't. It is sometimes years or decades before their theories can be confirmed through actual direct observation. In 1766, the English scientist Henry Cavendish postulated the existence of what we now call hydrogen. Cavendish saw that when it was combined with what we now call oxygen, it created water. So for the first time in human history, water was understood not to be a fundamental element, as the ancients believed, but was rather a compound of two or more fundamental substances. 15 years later, he determined that the ratio between hydrogen and oxygen and water was 2-to-1, although this was not confirmed until 1800 when the German scientist Johann Ritter used electricity, what we call electrolysis, or electrolysis, to separate the two elements. In 1811, the Italian Amedeo Avogadro confirmed Ritter's experiment, and only later understood that molecules were composed of atoms, but no human being would see a molecule for 2 centuries. All science regarding molecules and atoms was done without seeing, so they could not make observations to come to those conclusions. Of course, some things were seen and observed, but the molecules themselves could not be seen and observed. Their existence was inferred, but not observed. The existence of molecules was inferred, but not observed. So when it comes to the rationality of faith, specifically Christian theism, we can see that the existence of God that Christians infer, even though they can't observe, is not too far different from what these historic scientists did. They inferred, but not observed. But yet, Contemporary scientists will say that what the theist does is irrational to arrive at their conclusion. But yet, the contemporary scientific atheist will stand on the shoulders of men who base their conclusions on inference, not observation. It's very hypocritical and inconsistent. No one dared to claim that there was anything unscientific going on when the existence of molecules was inferred but not observed. In fact, this is the very foundation of all our modern chemistry. So not only was it not unscientific, it was as scientific as science can hope to be. It was the quintessence of science, and yet it did not include what could be seen, either with naked human eyes or aided by optical lenses. In any event, the theorizing continued, and of course it would not have continued if the fundamental ideas behind the theory at the bottom of it all didn't make sense. But this is the essence of much science over the centuries. So the idea that matter is the only thing in existence is not merely absurd, but it is unscientific. The idea that matter is the only thing in existence is not merely absurd, but it is also unscientific. Although it is true that we may not be able to scientifically prove that anything lives beyond the boundaries of our universe, neither can we say we know there is nothing beyond the boundaries of our universe. That is simple logic. Science has its limits and must accede to the rules of logic and rationality. Few scientists dispute all matter in the universe emerged from nothing nearly 14 billion years ago in what we call the Big Bang, even though there was no one there to observe the Big Bang or to record the Big Bang. Science equally maintains that matter and energy cannot be created or destroyed, which is the first law of thermodynamics. So science expects us to accept something, the Big Bang, that violates what is an immutable law of matter. But no real scientist has any difficulty in maintaining this awkward tension, because this is simply the strange pass or impasse to which logic and the evidence have taken us. Real scientists do not get tangled in these things and know that our imaginations and minds must do their best with what we have at hand. As we've said, theorizing brings our imagination and our minds into the picture, and without our minds to fill what we see or touch or smell or hear or taste, we would know no more about science than a dog or a cat or a mouse, all of whom have the same five senses we do, but lack brains capable of imagining anything at all, including the past, present, or future. The things that sets the humans apart from the animals is the fact that the humans, because they're created in God's image, have the brains capable of imagining. Because humans are created in God's image, they have capabilities that members of the animal kingdom do not. While we're on the subject, we might also say that the concept of time itself is similarly dodgy. For who has ever seen time? Time is immaterial. Who has smelled time? Who has tasted time, or touched time, or heard time? But science is always trafficked in such things, and proudly so. Therefore, any implication that no one should do so is anti-science, as we have said. Even reductionist materialist atheists use immaterial things to arrive at their materialist conclusions. Time is an example of something immaterial that they use to function in their materialist worldview. Though science cannot tell us what time is, nor for that matter what energy is, scientists have nonetheless included both these things in their equations to rather impressive effect. So even if we aren't at all sure what time and energy are quite yet, we can certainly work with them as concepts until we do. A classic example of a scientist using his imagination to great effect concerns one of the greatest of all molecular theorists, August Kekulé. Kekulé often told the story of a dream he had in 1862 while dozing in an armchair by a fire in Ghent, Belgium. In the dream, Kekulé beheld a dancing string of carbon atoms like a snake taking its own tail in its mouth and creating a circle. When he awoke, he realized that this was what benzene must look like. And as it happened, he was right. The idea, of course, came to him from someplace other than the actual experimentation or conscious cogitation. Materialism can only carry us so far. So Kekulé had a dream, and the dream actually predicted something true. That's interesting. We have biblical precedent for that. Joseph, for instance. Of course, Kekulé never got to see a carbon atom with his own eyes. In fact, it wasn't until 2009 that any human ever saw any molecule. Would it be right to say that we took their existence on faith until then? Yes and no. Anyone who wants to make these issues of faith and science black and white is actually confusing the issue and making everything gray and sloppy. These things are far too important for muddying semantics. But a stranger question must be raised when we're talking about molecules and atoms. It seems that even when we have recently claimed to see them, we have not seen them in the strict definition of seeing. That's because in order to see them, we've had to use various kinds of imaging. But it is less like taking it's less like taking a photo than it is like feeling someone's face with one eyes closed and describing it. That's because light, which is what we use to see and take photographs, has a wavelength that's much too big to illuminate something as small as an atom or a molecule. So, in the 1920s, scientists came up with what we call electron microscopes, which shoot beams of electrons at whatever we want to see. Since the wavelengths of electrons can be 100,000 miles smaller than the wavelengths of light photons, we can magically see atoms and molecules. But if we're seeing something without light, if we're seeing something without light, are we actually seeing? So yes, in recent decades, we've created some images of molecules and atoms, but we've never photographed them or seen them with our eyes. Actually, it was only in 2018 that we did come close to seeing an atom. This was when a student at Oxford named David Nadlinger managed to take a photograph of a single atom, which marked the first time that human beings could see one. Although, even so, it is such an exquisitely tiny blue dot that one cannot make out any details. There's David Nadlinger, and there's his photograph of an atom. I'm guessing it's that blue dot in the middle of those 2 points. Also, it had to be isolated and flooded with laser light so that one could argue that what one saw was actually only the laser light and that the atom itself was essentially incidental to the photo. But there it was, if one could use one's imagination, the outrageously tiny thing we've been theorizing about for millennia. In fact, it was only 5 years before this that scientists were able to observe molecules doing what we have known they do for 150 years, which is react chemically such that their structures change. But not seeing them do this never prevented us from intuiting and inferring they were doing these things. And then, of course, from experimenting to see if our intuitions and inferences were correct. So let's see how science points beyond science. We've made this point earlier, but must underscore it. A terrible thing has happened in the lives of strict materialists in the 1960s. A terrible thing happened in the lives of strict materialists in the 1960s, when it was proved by the discovery of the background radiation in the universe that the universe had a beginning. For one thing, we could no longer still say that the universe had always been here. So, there was ample time for absolutely anything to happen. Yes, if the universe was always here, there would be ample time for anything. Time is, of course, the friend of someone grasping at straws for how things got to be the way they are, but suddenly there was no more infinity of time, right? Once it was demonstrated that the universe had a beginning, there was no more infinity of time. Suddenly there was a starting point. But what strict materialists cringed at even more was the idea that time and energy and matter had been created from nothing. Everyone knew that this was not possible, and yet there it was. It was embarrassing. 2,000 years ago, Lucretius declared that nothing could come out of nothing, or rather, that the only thing that could come out of nothing was nothing. And as we said, the first law of thermodynamics says energy and matter cannot be created or destroyed. Energy can change form and become matter, just as matter may change form and become energy. Einstein explained that in his famous formula, that energy can change form and become matter, and matter can change form and become energy. Einstein explained that in his famous formula, E equals mc squared. But how could they be created how could they be created as we now know they had been created 13.8 billion years ago? Out of literally nothing burst black empty space and time in every single atom of matter that ever existed. Science essentially says something like that cannot happen, but that it did happen. What to do? Here was an embarrassing conundrum that could no longer be denied or hidden away in some attic. It was a mystifying Mobius strip of logic. It was an Escher drawing at the heart of all reality. Science itself leads us outside of science. The discovery of the background radiation in 1964 cinched the case for a universe with a distinct beginning, one so distinct that there was no possibility ever of transgressing into the world before that beginning, because it is the kind of beginning without any before. It is the boundary where space and time cease to exist in a way that so scrambles the human mind that we must simply walk away to gather ourselves. But this ended the idea that the universe had always existed, just as a monstrous iron portcullis decisively ends a horse's ability to enter a castle. There's so much about the Big Bang that was discomfiting to strict materialists and atheists. It meant that science had bumped into an impenetrable wall. That wall was infinitely high and infinitely wide. There was no way around it. In other words, science could take us back to the moment of the Big Bang, but could not go past the Big Bang. To many, it must have been utterly infuriating. And not only because it suggested a beginning before which science could not go, but it suggested a state of things that was absolutely untenable from a scientific point of view. It meant that the closer to the Big Bang we went, the smaller the universe got, and the denser and the hotter, until you arrived at a point smaller than anything physically imaginable, with infinite density, meaning a universe crushed down to where no electron had room to fly around a nucleus. All the space between things had been sucked out as if by a straw. And what in the world is infinite density? Can we imagine it? Not. But that's what science has led us to. And it would have been infinitely hot, too, whatever that can mean. We are, of course, entirely beyond meaning with such things. We've arrived at a place where any real scientist understands that it is his duty to bow and depart from the room. Science has led us to the end of science. It has led us to the limit of science, to the place where scientists must turn away from science for answers. This is the place where a sign might read, "No science past this point." And a literal point it was, too, 13.8 billion years ago. It was all the dimensions of the cosmos contained in one dimension, in a point. How can this be? The astronomer Joseph Silk said that a singularity, which is the official scientific term created to express whatever the no entrance sign meant, a singularity is completely unacceptable as a physical description of the universe, a place where the laws of physics and even space and time break down. This is why, when the initial evidence of the expanding universe and the Big Bang appeared to Einstein, it so bothered him that he waved it away as absurd and fudged his equations so they pointed away from any such thing, later dubbing it the greatest blunder of his life. That was talked about, I think, earlier in this book, and also, I think, in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, the cosmological constant, the fudge factor. And doesn't the Big Bang say even more? Time and space can be shown to have begun at some point in the past, and we know they are not a given. that the idea of something existing outside time and space is possible and even probable, since the universe had to come from somewhere, even if it's not a physical or material somewhere. So, like William Lane Craig would say in the Kalam cosmological argument, he would say um, that since we know time and space had a beginning, something outside of time and space must have been responsible for the beginning of time and space. Um, that cause must be, how does it go? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. And that cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, transcendent, and mostly powerful. So if time and space can be shown to have begun at some point in the past, then we know they're not a given, that the idea of something existing outside time and space is possible, even probable, since the universe had to come from somewhere, even if it's not a physical or material somewhere. By definition, time and space came from beyond time and space, from some world where they were created, presumably. Can't it be a physical place without time or space? Whatever that place is, it would at least have to have a dramatically different sense of time and space than we do in our universe. It seems that when we speak of eternity, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a place that is at once infinitely present and yet also stretching infinitely forward and backward, but that doesn't feel like forever. It is what we may call the eternal present. We can perhaps imagine this, but it has nothing to do with our five senses. But it really is like a person born blind trying to imagine color. A person born blind trying to imagine color, that sounds like something that wouldn't be possible. Trying to explain to someone color who's never seen color. We're in a realm that's not irrational, but it's nonetheless stupefying. Not irrational, but it doesn't make sense. Isn't this roughly what the Bible says about the nature of things? That God, who's outside time and space, who has existed eternally, created this world? How can we rationally explain that? How can we scientifically explain that? Other creation myths simply don't postulate that kind of God. The Bible says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1, and there are various places in the Bible where God really does seem to be outside of time. When he asks Moses his name, and he says, I am who I am in Exodus 3:14, and Jesus says in John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. And of course the God of the Bible must be outside of time if he knows the future and tells Moses how the world came into being. But it is in the poetic drama of the book of Job that we get the clearest picture of a God outside time and space. God asks Job a series of breathtaking questions, especially when we consider that it was written centuries before the birth of Christ. God asks Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? There's sarcasm in it, of course, so that it was simultaneously glorious and funny. And then God says to Job, to what were its foundations fastened, or who laid its cornerstone? Where, in the history of human literature, do we have anything like this? It goes on. Who shut the sea? Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, have you commanded the morning? Have you, Job, commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you, Job, entered the springs of the sea, or have you, Job, walked in search of the depths? And yet it gets even stranger and more beautiful. Where is the way of the dwelling of light and darkness? Where is its place, that you take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home? And then the magnificent, as the reign of Father? Those are from Genesis, or rather Job chapter 38. Clearly, God who's speaking does not exist within this material universe of space and time, and it is clear, too, that he created this world in which we live. He's not subject to the forces of nature and is not himself a force of nature. He is beyond all these things and behind all these things. So that's the end of chapter 23 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time we will do chapter for the impossible bleakness of materialism. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.